Thank you, Gary. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you all being here today to speak in lawyerese. There's some things emails can't do that you really need to be there in corpus to accomplish and to get your message across as strong as you possibly can. My delegate for much of my life was Vince Callahan, and he was asked one day in a town hall meeting. This was in the 90s, sort of pre-email, if you will, at least mass email. Well, how many letters do you need to get on a subject to really take separate notice of it? And he thought about it. He said, yeah, 5. And needless to say, everybody in the room was pretty stunned at how low that number was. But that tells you, first of all, how few people actually engaged simply to the degree of writing a letter. And I would encourage you to do that. Letters still count more than emails, especially when all the emails say the same thing. We know what's going on there. And we figured that one out. But better than that is your presence in person. And I still use the same analogy in describing working in the General Assembly session, and it is like drinking from a fire hose, which if you're thirsty, you do what you got to do. But it's a tough way to try and stay on top of an agenda, to track it, to pursue it, to advance it in the very fast-paced 60 days that the General Assembly is living with right now, this being the long session. And as the Speaker mentioned, the budget will dominate, but there are going to be literally hundreds of other subject matter areas contained in thousands of bills that will be addressed. So it is very important for you to be here in person. And I would urge you not only to advocate whatever your priorities today may be, but to try and build a bridge to your delegate, your senator, so you're a person they call when particular subject areas come up. You all are lobbyists today, and lobbyists get a pretty hard knock frequently, but one thing they are very valuable for is educating. I can tell you as a legislator, I would see literally 100-200 different subject areas a session. And I don't make any bones about the fact that I am not an expert in those 100 or 200 subject areas. It sure helps me when there are people I can go to that I know, trust, and have worked with to address those, and if nothing else, even if they don't agree with me, to educate me up on what I need to know to make a good decision. And then once the education has happened, you get your pitching opportunity about pros and cons, but nonetheless, surely we all want our legislators as well informed as possible when they're making these decisions. Since I am here and since I'm the Attorney General, I do want to point out a couple of things that you don't necessarily hear about from our office. Gary touched on a few. The mental health work I did in the Senate has continued into the Attorney General's office. It's such a complicated area and it impacts so many people in Virginia. I would venture to say that whether you know it or not, you all know a family or a family member who is dealing with mental illness issues. And they affect an awful lot of things that we do or that we're unable to do here in the Commonwealth. And that's an area that I've worked on since the mid to late 90s, long before I was running for office. And we have improved in Virginia. We have a long way to go. That's just one example. We also in the Attorney General's office have become the hub, if you will, and this is something I also started in the Senate, in fighting human trafficking. Something that's been getting more attention lately, but some of us have been trying to refocus some of our efforts in Virginia in this direction for about 5 years now. And we're seeing, those of you from Northern Virginia may have seen some of the recent convictions of MS-13 members. Gangs are getting into this. They have done the cost-benefit analysis, and yes, they do cost-benefit analyses. It is more benefit for less risk to traffic in minor girls than to sell drugs. And it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that way. We are working hand in glove with our Eastern District of Virginia federal partners as well as local law enforcement to interdict this problem, also to uncover it, which is one of the biggest challenges we face. We've been doing a lot of training out of the Attorney General's office. And not to be too unseemly, but a brothel is not a brothel. There's the traditional kind you think of where everybody who's there wants to be there. And it's their way of making money, even if it's illegal and sad and tragic in many ways. But then there's another one that looks just like it. And they're not there voluntarily. They're being held there by fraud, deception, intimidation, a variety of ways. Some of them were runaways in this country. Some of them, part of the pressure, if you will, is that they're illegal and that they're half afraid of being deported, while one might think in the life that they have stumbled into, that seems the lesser of two evils. But those tactics are now used, and spotting one from the other can be very challenging because they prepare for our arrival. They get their stories straight beforehand and so on and so on. They're not dumb, just evil. And we have put a lot of effort in the last several years since I've become Attorney General into advancing Virginia across the board, local law enforcement, partnerships with the federal government, and at the state level, in bettering our ability to deal with this problem. Medicaid fraud, you also heard mentioned, with the budget challenges that we face, certainly since I've been Attorney General, I'm now an agency head instead of a senator. I have a somewhat different perspective, but my budget has shrunk. Every section, we go division and then section, every section in my office has either shrunk or stayed the same size, with one exception, and that's the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, which in my 2 years has grown by 50%. And it was the biggest section in my office when I arrived. And that is a reflection of the demand in the caseload, how much healthcare fraud there is out there. That raises all of our healthcare costs. It is not only stealing money from the taxpayers, but it comes out of a pot of money set aside for people who cannot otherwise care for themselves. It is a very motivating undertaking. These cases are complicated. They're white-collar crime investigations. They take 2 to 4 years, roughly, to bring a case all the way to fruition, sometimes even longer when they're complicated enough. But Virginia has the best Medicaid fraud control unit in the country of all the states. The only ones even in our league are states like California, Florida, Texas, and New York. And you will notice among all 4 of those, they are all a lot bigger than Virginia. Per person in our office, we are doing better than anybody in the country. And that's reflected by the fact that they come to Virginia to train, including federal agents, come to Virginia to train. We expect to see the fruits of those efforts over the course of the next couple of years. It does take a while, but this is an enormous problem to tackle. We're also dealing with it legislatively by trying to get more fraud oversight in our Medicaid system. We also have aggressively pursued child pornographers, including producers of it. Recently, sadly, a police officer in Enrico, right near where we're sitting. 31-year-old was convicted and we got substantial jail time. He was producing it. And that means that he was bringing children in to create that material. That's where the cycle begins. And we put a lot of effort on these child pornographers because of the very high propensity. It's hard to really get a hard number, but 30, 40% who will act out if they're not interdicted, if we don't get to them. So these public safety initiatives are some of what we deal with. I mentioned MS-13. We do gangs on 2 sides. We prosecute them, and we have put a lot of effort into keeping kids out in the first place, giving them the tools to make the choice to say no, to walk away. And we've been very successful in that area in the last few years. I do want to thank you all for your work in keeping Virginia's economy going. Opportunity is an absolutely critical element to quality of life in Virginia and to our future success as a Commonwealth. The difficult economy puts a tremendous strain on everyone, but certainly on businesses to simply stay afloat. And we appreciate the effort you all put in every day to do that. And I know the challenges you face come from all angles. As best we can, I know the speaker would agree, he talked about PLAs, I'll touch on them in a moment. We want to keep government off your back as best we can. No additional tax burdens, no additional regulatory burdens that aren't absolutely, clearly necessary. And the last thing you want creating a new challenge is your own government. One of the huge things, huge uncertainties hanging over the economy is what's going to happen in this federal health care lawsuit. I know that affects costs of hiring and just the certainty with respect to how you predict your health care costs just a year out from now, 2 years out from now. That creates a tremendous strain on the economy. It's true for the state government as well. We, looking ahead, don't know what our health care costs is going to be just as soon as next year, with that decision coming from the Supreme Court this June, which is when we will hear from them. We sued the federal government shortly after that bill was signed, 2 weeks after our General Assembly on a bipartisan basis passed the Virginia Health Care Freedom Act, which was intended to protect Virginians from an insurance mandate. I know there are some other insurance mandates you all deal with here in the General Assembly. It's nice to see them trying to stop a mandate once in a while instead of impose another one. But we won that case in December of 2010 in the district court. We were the first state to do so. It has moved forward, and the Fourth Circuit took a different view, but now the Supreme Court is going to decide that finally. And our basic argument, you all are in commerce. The federal government, under Article 1, Section 8, the Commerce Clause, can regulate interstate commerce. They have that power. It is a very broad power. But what they have done in the federal health care bill is attempted to compel you and every other American into commerce. You must buy this product. That has never been done before. In fact, if you go back to the colonial era, when we were boycotting British goods, the Attorney General and the Solicitor General for King George III sat in Parliament by tradition. They were asked, isn't this boycott treason? Pretty weighty question. And the answer was no, it is not. And the flip side of that coin is that they couldn't compel colonists. We weren't citizens, we were subjects. They couldn't compel subjects to buy British goods. But that's what this federal health care bill does. It is absolutely historically unprecedented in the breadth of the power being exercised. And we will see in 5 months whether the federal government essentially has no limits in this area. Because if they can order you to buy a product, they can order you, if they can order you to buy health care, they can order you to buy any product. So I tell people this case isn't about health care, it's about liberty. Because you can take health insurance out, put automobiles in. You can put asparagus in. You can put gym memberships. Those are the examples the judge used in court in our case. The judge, not us. And I'll tell you, they have a little interest in General Motors these days. They'll make you buy a GM car, of course. And my own speculation is they'll make you buy a Chevy Equinox. I own a Chevy Equinox. You don't want to own a Chevy Equinox. And that's exactly why that's the one they'll make you buy. It's the old Reagan quote, if it stops moving, subsidize it. Well, that's what will happen there. That's what that power would mean in other areas of the economy. Health care is personal to people. And it gets very personal at certain points in our lives. Very intense, very emotional. But it is a product, it is a service. It is subject to the laws of economics like everything else. Legislatures, be it in Richmond or in Washington, like to think that they can statutorily change the laws of economics. If they thought they could get the fat vote, they'd outlaw gravity. They can't do that. They can't do that. You can't change that. You can delay impacts, you can skew who has to bear what cost, but you can't change the underlying economic realities. And that's what is attempted to be done, and that is a bipartisan failing. And it isn't unique to Washington or Richmond. But it can go so far sometimes, as it has in that federal health care bill, that it actually tramples on the Constitution. And that's exactly why we're in court. The first obligation of an Attorney General, the first thing in my oath of office, is to defend the U.S. Constitution. And that's what we're doing in that case. In another matter, a suit we brought even beforehand was with the EPA, the Employment Prevention Agency. And they're very good at that. Now, mind you, we have responsibilities in my office for environmental compliance and enforcement, and we undertake those. So even while we're suing the EPA, we're partnering with them, particularly in the clean water area in Virginia, to undertake enforcement actions where that's appropriate, and we've done that over the 2 years I've been there. But there's a balance out there, and more important than that, there is a statutory scheme that they have to operate within. In December of 2009, the EPA declared carbon dioxide a pollutant dangerous to public health. It's so dangerous, we are all exhaling it. It keeps the trees alive, helps them produce oxygen, but it is now a dangerous pollutant. They can, under this ruling, regulate any emissions of CO2 over 250 tons. And to give you a sense, that's what's 250 tons of a gas. This building will produce 250 tons, I would expect, in the course of 1 year. That means this hotel would have to get a permit. The cost of that permitting right now is about $125,000 a year. They cannot logistically handle all these permits. If every state EPA, we call it DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, if every single one of them did nothing but these permits, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it, though we'd rake in a lot of money. But what this will do to factory emissions, car emissions, power plant emissions, and the cost of electricity is staggering. It is staggering. Everything we buy that takes energy, it targets the energy sectors and the food sectors primarily. So if you don't use energy or eat, don't worry about it, it won't affect you. But everybody else is going to see substantially higher costs of doing business and of just living. And unfortunately, what this does, it doesn't make Virginia any more or less competitive with North Carolina or Maryland, but it makes America less competitive with India, with China, with other places around the world that are more than happy to scoop up job opportunities that we're chasing offshore. This is politically driven, primarily. It's the only conclusion one can draw. It is not a protect the planet agenda. How do I know this? The head of the EPA, Lisa Jackson, her title is the administrator of the EPA, testified under oath before the U.S. Senate and said that by the year 2100, the benefits of this regulation will be immeasurable. That means you can't measure them. Let me just give you one example of a cost that they say this will impose. The EPA says, not Ken Cuccinelli, that every new car and light truck will cost another $950 on average when this regulation is fully phased in. So who can't buy a new car or light truck? There are people who can afford the $950 more dollars. They'll buy their car, their truck. They'll have a little less money in their pocket. But lower middle income and poor people will not get a new car. Make no mistake, when across the board regulation like this occurs, the people hurt first and worst are the poor. It is always the poor who are hurt first and worst. They're the least able to respond. Let's go back to job relocation. Capital can move. It's a whole lot harder for me to pick my family up and move to India. And I'm not terribly inclined to do that. So I suffer the lower standard of living, and by the way, the poorer you are, the less ability to move you've got. It is very important for us to remember that. And if you think of Virginia as a commonwealth, as it is, the places hurt worst within Virginia are already the poorest and already struggling with the highest unemployment in Virginia. That's what this does to Virginia. And I have to say, to the extent it drives up electricity rates, it was intended for that purpose. Incredibly, we filed this suit in February of 2010. This past September, incredible revelation came out of the EPA. Their own inspector general came out with a report saying exactly what we've been saying all along, that the EPA failed to comply with the law. And that's the only way I get in. People come up to me all the time, oh, this agency's doing this, can you sue them? No. That's what elections are for. We only get in with a lawsuit when they are breaking the law or violating the Constitution. It's the only time we get in. But even their own inspector general has found that to be the case within the EPA. This is really quite incredible. That they also failed in their responsibility to determine the accuracy of their own data. I won't say their own data. They used other people's data. They delegated out the science. It's political science is what it was. They delegated out the science behind this greenhouse gas endangerment finding. So we are suing the EPA to essentially send it back to the EPA so they reopen their hearing process and consider all of these factors. That's all we're asking them to do. We're not trying to stop it. We're trying to have it done right, which may mean not doing it at all, but that is ultimately going to be up to the EPA. That will be argued in 1 month, the end of February in the D.C. District Court, Court of Appeals, D.C. Circuit. Virginia and Texas will argue for states. There's a bunch of private parties in there. In fact, there are so many, it is the biggest case in terms of the number of parties that the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals has ever had in its history. That's how broad and wide that impact is. And I mentioned electricity rates. You all are here in Richmond. One thing I would alert you to is, and one of the roles I have as Attorney General is to advocate for you, the consumers of Virginia, when electricity rates are before this SCC. You all really need to be on watch for bills that raise those rates because they are happening. And they're rolling right through the General Assembly in some instances. And there are some concentrated benefits of these bills. RPS bills, which even a lot of our environmentalist allies in these, with respect to these bills, Cuccinelli and the Sierra Club are in the same place on a lot of these bills. And they are bad for business in Virginia, they're bad for the standard of living, and they're bad for our competitiveness. And you all really need to be the voice for that. And I would urge you to look very closely at those bills. Charles Poindexter, Delegate Poindexter, has one that gets rid of some RPS adders. These are bumps that the utilities can come into the SCC and just claim. If they do X, if they build, and I'll use a real world example, $8 million worth of windmills, which they then charge their ratepayers for, they get that recouped. They also get, under the RPS adders, a 0.5 point increase, 0.5% increase on their return across their entire rate base. So what do they get for spending that $8 million that they get from you? They get $77 million more. Great business if you can get it. You're going to pay me back my capital, guaranteed, and I'm going to get a 9, almost 10 times return on that investment, unrisked investment. That all goes right into your cost of doing business. Every bit of it. Every bit of it. We have had other contests that deal with right to work with the National Labor Relations Board that with Boeing, you all undoubtedly saw that. The NLRB has been very active and very problematic, pushing the outer boundaries of the law. We are watching very closely PLAs in Virginia, particularly with respect to Dulles Rail. Phase 2 right now is what's on everybody's front burner. It has never been any secret. I oppose this project entirely. It is an incredible boondoggle. It's the biggest waste of money in the history of Virginia. And I say that in raw dollar terms, and I'm willing to back it up with numbers. You heard the mechanical engineering degree. I'm a geek. I've read the environmental impact statement. It was a long time ago, but I've read it. And my favorite table is still 6.2, which shows of 8 trips that will take place after they build the whole thing, 4 of them take the same amount of time or more building the Dulles Rail project. And we're going to spend billions of dollars on doing this. It is a real estate deal, not a transportation project. So, but if we're going to do it, by golly, we're going to do it without PLAs over my dead body. And so that is something that we keep a very close eye on. Virginia has a huge competitive advantage being a right-to-work state. That was why we leaped into putting the coalition of AGs together when the NLRB went after Boeing in South Carolina, because they weren't going after Boeing in South Carolina. They were going after the right to work. Make no mistake about it. That was an intimidation tactic, so no other companies will want to take them on, moving from the 28 union states to Virginia or any of the 22 right-to-work states. So with that, I will close. And thank you all for being here. Like I said, your presence, I think, is very important to maintaining Virginia as a great place to do business. And we don't do it just for that, but that makes it a great place to live. And I'm proud to be a Virginian, lived here just about my whole life, and I'm so glad you all are here today to help us keep it a great place to be. God bless all of you.